You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but the worst nuclear disaster of the Cold War didn't happen in Ukraine. It happened closer, under our own flag, and we signed papers to make sure nobody ever said a word. Back then, I thought I was just running routine surveillance in Berlin, tapping static, decoding chatter, chasing ghosts through cables. It started out like any other operation, until at DIDN single quotes T, that we were trained for everything except for silence. And silence was the only thing Washington wanted. Not the truth, not the reports, not the bodies. Just silence. I didn't sign up for that part, but they sure made it look like I did. Before I regret saying any of this, hit that like button. Subscribe if this is already making you uncomfortable. And tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is. I like knowing where in the world people still dare to listen to secrets like these. They called it a routine intercept. That's how they framed it when the order came down from Berlin Station. 2 weeks after Chernobyl, we were still knee-deep in Soviet chatter, and I thought I'd be listening for fallout reports or troop movements on the border. Instead, the cable mentioned an anomaly west of Bavaria, our side of the line. That already smelled wrong. I took the night train, riding in a compartment that stank of damp wool and cigarettes. The German conductors didn't ask questions, not when your passport said technical attach. I carried only a briefcase with a battered shortwave unit inside. The job was simple. Triangulate the frequency the KGB had flagged, record any patterns, and hand it off. Simple never stayed simple. By dawn, I was in a gray office above a bakery in Munich. The radio was alive with hissing bands, and then I caught it. A burst of coded Morse, clipped, too urgent to be training chatter. I scribbled down the sequences, cross-checked them against our book, and the message bled through. Incident, Western installation, containment breached. I remember the pause I took, staring at the paper. They weren't talking about Ukraine. They weren't even talking about the Soviets. The colonel who debriefed me had the kind of calm that meant he already knew. He skimmed the page, handed it back like it was nothing, and muttered, "File it under agricultural weather data." That was the line we used when something had to disappear. I'd filed crop reports before, but never one that smelled of cesium and strontium. Later that night, I sat in my rented room, the briefcase open, the unit still humming. You ever smell fresh paint and think someone's hiding something? That was how the message felt, like a coat slapped over rot. Outside, Munich was quiet, beer halls spilling laughter into the streets. Inside, I held a sheet of paper that said, "The ground under our allies was glowing hotter than Chernobyl." Back then, I didn't think much of it. But looking back, that moment changed everything. It should have ended as another routine intercept, burned in the stove with the rest of the scraps. That should have been the end of it. But then the next set of maps came across my desk. The package arrived rolled tight, sealed with a stamp that wasn't ours. Satellite imagery, grainy, black and white overlays with blotches of red ink to mark heat. I'd seen hundreds, maybe thousands in Berlin. You learn to read them like a doctor reads an X-ray. Smudges, gradients, patterns that only make sense once you've stared too long. This one didn't need expertise. The mark was screaming back at me, a bloom of heat, concentrated and irregular. Sat west of Bavaria. Not Soviet, not civilian. The coordinates pointed to a U.S. military site, long written off as mothballed since '79. I'd filed its closure myself in a report that gathered dust somewhere in Langley. Officially, deactivated. Unofficially, the thing was still burning. I carried the sheet across town to a safe flat, closed the curtains, spread it on the floor with pins holding the edges. Every contour line told the same story, radiation bleeding. From below, spiking against the background, noise like a flare. I had seen Chernobyl's thermal data just days before. This was worse, more focused, angrier, like the earth itself was exhaling poison. The chatter from Washington came late that night, a secure line, clipped voices, no names. That image doesn't exist. I said nothing. The facility is stable. I kept my jaw tight. Stable wasn't what those maps said. They told me to destroy the packet. I folded it instead, slipped it inside the lining of my briefcase. You learn to keep one copy, even when the order says otherwise. The following morning, I went back to the bakery office. Coffee bitter enough to scrape enamel, the radio buzzing with Soviet engineers, gossiping about iodine pills. But my eyes kept dragging back to the ghost bloom on that map. You don't imagine radiation. Either it's there, or it isn't. And on those sheets, it was shouting. That evening, walking the cobblestones near Sendlinger Tor, I noticed a figure trailing me. Tall, stiff posture, too clean a haircut for Munich. He stopped when I stopped. Amateur, but official. By the time I ducked into a tram, he was gone. I told myself it was routine shadowing. Berlin was full of watchers. But that heat mark on the paper, that wasn't routine. I didn't sleep much. The ceiling cracks looked like fault lines, and my thoughts kept circling one truth. A reactor that shouldn't exist was awake, and no one was supposed to know. We burned the photos the next day. But one copy stayed with me, and years later, another one showed up where it shouldn't have. I found him through a half-broken chain of phone numbers. Officially, he was a radio operator, tucked away in a nondescript army communications wing near Augsburg. Unofficially, he'd been filing reports nobody wanted to read. He called himself just another switchboard ghost. The booth was marked 13, a cubicle lined with peeling acoustic foam and stale cigarette smoke. He sat hunched, pale under fluorescent light, hands trembling over the dials. His voice cracked when he told me about the nosebleeds. About the hair? Falling out in clumps? About kids in nearby towns being born wrong, too many fingers, missing organs. He said he'd set everything up the chain months ago. And then the files vanished. Access revoked. His clearance stripped. That night, after our meeting, I called his extension again. No answer. By morning the booth was empty, nameplate gone, desk cleared, like he'd never existed. I checked the logs. His reports had been stamped classified-archived. Only they weren't in any archive I could reach. Walking out of that building, I felt the weight settle in. Not paranoia, just recognition. Someone wanted the silence more than they wanted the truth. And silence has a way of erasing people faster than bullets. The station chief asked me if I'd gotten anything useful. I lied and said no. He nodded, almost relieved. That was the moment I realized my own words could disappear me, just as easily as they'd erased him. And that was the last time I trusted a locked door to mean someone was still behind it. The badge they gave me looked authentic enough, laminated, smudged at the edges, stamped with a seal no civilian would ever question. Technical inspector. That was the cover. I'd worn worse. Getting past the outer fence wasn't the problem. Getting past my own doubt was. The entrance was a rusted shaft disguised as a warehouse loading dock. 2 guards barely looked at me as I clipped the badge to my lapel. Inside, the air changed. Concrete stairwells spiraled down, every echo magnified until it felt like the walls were listening. 50 meters below, the air grew metallic, heavy, hot. The chamber was intact, if you could call it that. A reactor shell, cracked along one seam like a rotten tooth, still throbbing with heat. The walls sweated condensation. Every few seconds a faint click came from the Geiger counter at my hip. Louder than footsteps, louder than breath. The containment had held barely. Enough to keep it underground, not enough to call it safe. I remember pausing, pasting iron on my tongue. Radiation has no smell, but that day it did. Metal, dust, and something worse, secrecy baked into stone. I thought about the maps, the operator from Cabina 13, the sealed reports. It all pointed here. Then I heard it, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of suppression. No alarms, no sirens, just the hum of a machine that wasn't supposed to exist. I realized then that the real threat wasn't the reactor itself. It was the decision to let it keep breathing in the dark. When I surfaced, my shirt damp, 2 Marines were already waiting by the gate. One of them kept his hand near his rifle. The other avoided my eyes. Behind them, an officer in a pressed uniform with no name on his insignia. He said 4 words, "You don't belong here." And from that moment on, I knew the mission wasn't about containment. It was about containment of me. The officer's insignia was black, polished, but nameless. That was the first detail I noticed. No rank, no unit. Just authority, stripped of identity. He stood between me and the shaft I just climbed. 2 Marines flanking him like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence I hadn't chosen to write. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "This is not your jurisdiction." The way he said it, I wasn't sure if he meant Germany or the truth itself. My badge was useless now, a prop in a play they'd already canceled. They took my notes, the counter, even the gloves. Every scrap that could prove I'd been underground. When I protested quietly, too carefully, he tilted his head and said, "Consider yourself reassigned." The Marines didn't touch me. They didn't have to. The message was clear. I was done here. Back in Berlin, the cable from Langley was a single line. Cease activity. No explanation, no reference number, just a full stop. I'd been cut out of my own operation. That should have stung. Instead, it confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't espionage anymore. It was house cleaning. Walking home that night, I kept seeing the officer's insignia. Black, blank, nothing. You ever stare at something so empty, it feels heavier? And a name? That was the weight I carried. Weeks later, I overheard a junior officer whisper that the site would be stabilized by administrative closure. Not sealed, not decommissioned, just declared safe on paper. And once it's safe on paper, it's safe everywhere, at least for those who matter. I didn't write a report. I didn't have to. They'd already written mine for me. And somewhere in the margins, they'd signed my silence. That wasn't the end of the trail. It was just the point where the map stopped showing roads. She found me first. A woman with sharp eyes and a German accent that bent every English word into something heavier. She said she had once been part of the GDR's Atomic Oversight Committee. A scientist now stranded between allegiances, too disillusioned to serve. The East too tainted to be trusted by the West. People like her usually disappeared. Instead, she pushed a file into my hands. The folder smelled of damp paper and cigarettes. Inside, stamped pages from the Soviet Committee of Atomic Surveillance. Reports in Cyrillic, precise, merciless. One detail froze me. The Soviets had picked up the radiation leak days before we did. They'd tracked the plume, charted the drift, calculated the fallout. And they knew it wasn't from Chernobyl. Worse, the documents hinted at an arrangement. Not blackmail, not yet, but negotiation. The U.S. had leaned on Moscow to bury it. A silence for silence exchange. 2 enemies pretending to be custodians of the truth, when really they were co-signers of a lie. I asked her why she was giving it to me. She said she'd tried to defect once, had been denied. "No one wants an inconvenient witness," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette, ash spilling across the table. She told me to guard the file as if it were my own heartbeat. That night, back in my apartment, I read until dawn. The numbers etched themselves into me. Half-lives, isotopes, contamination radii. Cold math that didn't lie, even when men did. For the first time I understood the scale, not just an accident, but a bargain. A deal written in particles no one could see. When I tried to cable fragments back to Langley, the line cut mid-transmission. An hour later, a knock at my door, no one there, just silence pressed against the wood. That was when I realized the Soviets weren't the only ones listening. The invitation wasn't meant for me. A misplaced credential, a badge shuffled into the wrong envelope. That's how I ended up in a bland conference room on the edge of Geneva. 2 guards at the door, pretending not to hear. The air smelled of stale coffee and polished wood. At the table, one American diplomat, his suit too crisp for a man who hadn't slept, and across from him, a Soviet delegate with the kind of calm you only get when your leverage is absolute. Between them, folders stacked neatly, like props for a negotiation neither side intended to record. They spoke in clipped phrases, half English, half Russian. No translators, no need. Both understood the terms. Silence about Bavaria. In exchange for permission to dismantle a Soviet installation in Bulgaria quietly, off the books. 2 superpowers pretending to trade stability when all they traded was immunity. I watched from a shadowed corner, a ghost at their table. The American never mentioned lives lost, or soil poisoned, or families breathing ash. He mentioned optics. He mentioned balance. He mentioned that word I'd learned to hate, containment. The Soviet nodded, as if containment was a currency he'd always been ready to spend. A pen-scratched paper. 2 signatures. Not a treaty, not a deal, just an erasure. When they stood to leave, the diplomat glanced toward my corner. For a second, I thought he'd seen me. His eyes lingered just long enough to register doubt. Then he turned away, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. I didn't follow. There was nowhere left to follow. The silence had just been made official. And that's when I understood the Cold War wasn't about ideology. It was about paperwork. It arrived in Berlin in a dented courier case, hand-delivered by a man who wouldn't give his name. Inside, packed in dry ice that was already half melted, sat a capsule no bigger than a thermos. The label was military, faded, stamped with codes I didn't recognize. But the smell iron and rot cut through the cold. The note said it contained samples from a technician exposed during the Bavaria leak. Tissue, blood, bone marrow. The case was corroded, seams rusted, as if it had been stored too long in some forgotten locker. When I pried it open, the stench filled the room, and for a moment I thought I was holding a grave in my hands. A contact at a West German lab agreed to test it off the record. The results were worse than the numbers in the Soviet file. DNA twisted, chromosomes shredded. Damage too uniform, too violent to be called natural. This wasn't exposure, it was assault, cellular sabotage. I sent fragments of the findings through a back channel to Langley. A week later, the lab was raided by men in plain clothes. My contact vanished and the capsule was declared misplaced. When I asked for clarification, Washington replied with a single phrase: sample compromised, case closed. That was the first time I saw science turned into a ghost evidence reduced to rumor by an official stamp. That night, I left the city safe house, carrying nothing but a scrap of paper with the technician's initials. I burned it in a cafe ashtray before dawn. Not because I wanted to, but because I finally understood what happens to people who keep evidence too long. And yet, even now, I still wonder, who was he, and how many more capsules were buried before his? Grunwald was a quiet suburb, the kind of place where American officers bought houses to feel less like they were in Germany. Neat. Hedges, wide driveways, children riding bicycles on streets that smelled of pine. It was there I met her, a young mother who looked twice her age, clutching a folder too heavy for her hands, She invited me in without words, as if she already knew why I'd come. On the kitchen table, she laid out photographs. A newborn with twisted limbs, skin blotched and pale. Medical certificates with lines blacked out, signatures blurred under official stamps. She spoke quietly, afraid her neighbors might hear. The doctors had told her it was anomalous genetics. She knew better. She lived 10 minutes from the base dot. She showed me the document she'd signed. Non-disclosure, typed in sharp English. Legalese. In exchange, the U.S. military provided free treatment, transport to specialists, housing subsidies. But the condition was silence. Her child's suffering was classified. I asked why she trusted me. She said because no one else listened. Her voice broke only once when she admitted the boy had never left the hospital. "They tell me he's stable," she whispered, "but I'm not allowed to hold him." A photo stayed with me long. After I left the house, faces blurred, eyes wide, futures cut before they began. The folder weighed nothing in my bag, but it bent my shoulders all the same. Back at my flat, I lit a cigarette and stared at the ceiling until morning. This wasn't espionage anymore, or diplomacy, or containment. This was a child who would never walk, whose name would never appear on any record outside that suburban kitchen. And that was the night I realized the cover-up wasn't about hiding a reactor. It was about hiding lives. The base had always been listed as a power facility. Reactor research, non-operational. That was the line in the archives. But through a contact in the Bundesnachrichtens, I got hold of schematics that didn't match any civilian design. Too much reinforced piping, redundant coolant lines leading nowhere. This wasn't about electricity dot inside a dim archive in Munich. I spread the diagrams across a desk. Every mark pointed to something darker. The reactor wasn't a reactor. It was a weapons lab, an attempt at controlled fusion for battlefield use. Portable energy meant portable fire. Whoever signed off on it had buried the paperwork under layers of black budgets. I pictured the chamber I'd seen underground, those cracked walls, that humming heat. It wasn't malfunction. It was a failed experiment, an unauthorized push beyond safety, beyond oversight. A secret not even Congress had the clearance to know. The more I pieced together, the more it felt deliberate. Accidents leave trails of panic. This left trails of planning. Memos rerouted, signatures scrubbed, technicians rotated so no one saw the full picture. Except someone at the Pentagon, someone whose insignia didn't need a name. That night I asked myself the question that never appeared in any file. What were they testing it on? Soil, water, people nearby? The mother from Grunwald, the capsule samples, the silence around Cabina 13. It all fit too neatly. I tried to cable fragments of the schematics back to Langley. The line cut again. Minutes later, the archive's lights flickered. I heard footsteps. Outside, too heavy, too synchronized to be accidental. I slid the diagrams back into the folder, tucked it under my coat, and walked out as if I belonged. And for the first time, I felt certain. I hadn't uncovered an error. I'd stumbled into a design. He was waiting for me in a cafe off Kurfürstendamm, the kind of place where nobody ever finished a cup of coffee because the waiters kept refilling it. An old colleague, same tie clip, same nervous tapping of his foot under the table. We hadn't spoken in years. He lit my cigarette before his own, like nothing had changed, but everything had. He didn't waste time. He told me flat out, the cover-up wasn't improvisation, it was doctrine. Panic kills faster than radiation, he said, eyes fixed on the sugar bowl. The operation had been managed from inside, not by spies or soldiers, but by bureaucrats. With clean hands, people we'd trusted, people I had once taken orders from. I asked him why he was telling me. He shrugged, like it didn't matter anymore. Maybe guilt, maybe exhaustion. Or maybe he just wanted me to carry part of the weight. When I pressed, he leaned close and whispered, "For the country." That phrase again, always the shield, always the excuse. I realized in that moment we weren't on the same side anymore. He still believed in the silence. I didn't. We parted without shaking hands. He walked east, I walked west, and between, Use lay a street that felt longer than the wall itself. That night, I sat alone in my flat, the window open to the Berlin air. I thought about the men in nameless uniforms, about mothers signing away their children, about reactors humming under, forests. And I knew one thing: betrayal doesn't come with gunfire. It comes with paperwork, served by familiar faces. I never saw him again. Or maybe I did, just not the version of him I thought I knew. Years later, I drove past the site. No fences, no guards, no warnings. Just trees, young pines planted in neat rows, pretending nothing had ever been there. A sign read, "Protected Reserve." Families hiked, children kicked soccer balls, and the earth beneath them carried secrets thicker than roots. The files were gone. Every cable I'd sent, every intercept, every map vanished. Officially, the installation never existed. The technicians never worked there. The mothers never signed their papers. And the child from Grunwald? No record, no name, no grave. I used to think history was built on events. Turns out, it's built on documents. And if the documents vanish, so does the event. What isn't measured doesn't exist. That's how they erased Bavaria. Not with bulldozers, but with silence. Sometimes I hear people say, Chernobyl was the worst. I nod, I let them believe it. But inside, I carry a different weight. Because the truth isn't in the museums, or the headlines, or the archives. It's in the empty space where something once burned, and nobody dares to admit it. And that's why even now, whenever I hear the word containment, I wonder who they're really containing. I don't tell this to shock you. I tell it because silence makes men old faster than time does. The Cold War ended on paper, but the lies didn't. They just changed uniforms, traded acronyms, moved underground with the rest of the ghosts. Sometimes, late at night, I picture that corridor 50 meters below concrete, sweating, steel groaning, Geiger clicks echoing like a clock that never stops. I wonder if anyone else still hears it. Or if I was the last dot after Bavaria. I kept working for a while. Different missions, different cities. But something in me stayed buried with that reactor. Maybe trust, maybe belief. Doesn't matter now. What matters is this: the worst disaster of the Cold War didn't happen where they told you it did. And no archive, no treaty, no plaque will ever admit it. That's all I've got left to give you. The rest is forest. If you've stayed with me this far, hit like. Subscribe if you want more truths no one's supposed to say out loud. And tell me your city, your time. I still like knowing where the secrets land.